The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin is a 1969 novel which follows an envoy from Earth sent to establish diplomatic relations with an alien planet called Gethin. The Gethinians differ biologically from Terran humans in one major way. They lack distinct sexes. Instead, almost any Gethinian can reproduce with any other. As a result, their cultures functionally lack gender as a social institution. By deciding to tell such a story in written prose, Le Guin was faced with a decision. What third-person pronouns should she use to refer to the Gethinian characters? She considered a variety of options, including singular they and invented pronouns, but settled on he, him. Le Guin felt at the time that the gender-neutral he was accepted as standard, though she later admitted she was never quite satisfied with the decision, especially after it drew critique from feminist readers. Any English-language speculative fiction exploring non-normative ideas about gender inevitably has to contend with this issue of language. As far back as 1920, there was apparently a sci-fi novel called A Voyage to Arcturus, which featured an alien species made of air rather than solid matter, who used air pronouns. And if you do any research at all about the history of neopronouns, you'll hear about a cyberpunk novel from the 90s called Nearly Roadkill, which uses ze/here pronouns for its protagonists. I've never read this book, but its Goodreads synopsis is incredible. This novel is a tale of what appears to be boy meets what appears to be girl. Their world is the net, where any persona or gender can be created. These two genderless beings scratch and wink, cybersurf into various net worlds, fighting government intervention on this frontier. Amazing. No notes. But what I want to talk about in this video is the more recent wave of gender-weird sci-fi, much of which is written by queer and trans authors. And Leckie's Imperial Ratch book series, the dominant culture of the empire it's set in, much like the cultures of Left Hand, lacks gender as a social category. Leckie opts for she, her as the pronoun of choice, drawing on a history of other feminist attempts to use she as a neutral pronoun, pushing back against the assumption of male as default. I've seen some cis readers really struggle with the idea that Rajai culture is genderless, not just their language. You'll encounter people online talking about how weird it is to see she, her used for men, but like, the characters in question aren't men. They don't identify as such. The series is not especially ambiguous on this point. Later books establish that people use she, her for Rajai characters, even when speaking languages that make gender distinctions. And in the first novel, Ancillary Justice, the protagonist describes the crowds of a Rajai city as such. I saw them all, suddenly, for just a moment, through non-Rajai eyes, an eddying crowd of unnervingly ambiguously gendered people. I saw all the features that would mark gender for non-Rajai, never, to my annoyance and inconvenience, the same way in each place. Short hair or long, thick-bodied or thin, faces delicate-featured or coarse, with cosmetics or none, a profusion of colors that would have been gender-marked in other places. All of this matched randomly with bodies curving at breast and hip or not, bodies that one moment moved in ways various non-Rajai would call feminine, the next moment masculine. 20 years of habit overtook me, and for an instant I despaired of choosing the right pronouns, the right terms of address. But I didn't need to do that here. I could drop that worry, a small but annoying weight I had carried all this time. I was home. The book blurs the line between gendered language and gender in general. Leckie is leaning into linguistic relativity, the idea that language shapes and reflects the culture it's attached to. In the Imperial Ratch books, the lack of pronoun distinction and the lack of social gender roles are implicitly linked. The reality, though, is sometimes more complicated. In the article Translating Gender, Ancillary Justice in 5 Languages, writer Alex Daly McFarlane talked to people responsible for translating the first Imperial Ratch novel, and how they approached the specificity of the choice to use she when moving into languages that are either more or less gendered than English. The Hungarian translator noted, quote, "The way Brecht describes Rajai language, it seems closer to Hungarian than to English. Therefore, some Hungarian readers didn't get it. Why Brecht worries so much about choosing the right gender when referring to a person in another language. Many Hungarians make accidental mistakes like mistaking he and she and don't think too much of it." I think this is important to keep in mind as we continue discussing depictions of gendered pronouns in fantastical settings. Pronouns aren't gender. Still, for texts written in English, they inevitably inform how readers understand characters' genders, or lack thereof. Linguist Kirby Conrad has suggested in much of their work that gendered pronouns might be best understood as analogous to other forms of socially contextual pronouns.
So one of the things that I'm trying to sort of discuss with people is that there are a bunch of other kinds of pronouns in languages besides English, and English has had these in the past, but pronouns that encode sort of this very social information in the way that gender is, and still have grammatical consequences, and we have just been not using this model to explain what's going on with gender.
So things like formal versus informal you and these kinds of things?
Yeah, exactly. And this is a hard project because it doesn't look like pronouns are a natural class, meaning that they're not made out of the same stuff in every language. But languages generally need pronouns as a way to avoid saying the same name over and over again. And what this ends up doing is encoding social information to varying degrees.
Because there are lots of languages that don't have gender in pronouns at all.
The majority of the world's languages have no gender marking on their pronouns.
While Hungarian was apparently a relatively easy translation, the Bulgarian translator of Ancillary Justice faced a different situation. As she put it, quote, "The greatest problem with regards to my translation were the feminine forms for professions and military positions. As for non-military professions, we have an active tool to make any profession grammatically feminine by adding the suffix ka to the masculine form, professor, professorka. But lately the feminine forms are increasingly felt to be depreciative, and the masculine form is used even for women. I invented a third form for professions and military positions by adding just a instead of ka to the masculine form. A is the common ending for feminine with nouns. It is also the ending which turns a masculine adjective into a feminine one. In this way I had officera instead of officerka and inspectora instead of inspectorka, which are definitely felt as feminine, but without the depreciative nuance. It sounds a bit odd for the first couple of pages, but you get used to it pretty fast. In other words, when faced with a language paradigm that didn't allow for the nuances she was trying to express, she opted to invent new language. The follow-up novel Provenance, set elsewhere in the same universe as the Imperial Ratch trilogy, takes place in a three-gendered rather than genderless culture, where the third gender is referred to using the pronouns em. The setting of the Wayfarers book series by Becky Chambers is a multi-species, multicultural, interstellar society. Many of the alien peoples have gender systems that go beyond the binary, and in such cases, people use the neutral pronouns sie, them. There is a character in the first Wayfarers book who is referred to as they, and explicitly not sie, in the plural sense. They are a mammal bonded with a symbiont, which allows them to understand the mechanics of faster-than-light travel in a way that others can't. It's eventually revealed, though, that the symbiont is killing its host. The subplot culminates in the other characters insisting that they don't need to live like this, letting this thing kill them. In one scene, two of the other characters discuss the situation without them present. Sissix stood before him, hands on her hips. Kizzy tells me there's a cure for what's killing Ohan, one that would leave him able to navigate and that would extend his life by a good century or so. She tells me you just came back from a planet full of happy, healthy people who can all attest to that. And apparently, that cure is in our medbay right now, and you're just going to let it gather dust while Ohan lies shaking himself to death in a pool of his own sick. Ashby swung his eyes up to her. You keep saying his. Yes, because it finally occurred to me that Ohan is an individual, a sick man who needs our help. Sissix, this is not my call. What do you want me to do? Tie them down and force it on them? If that's what it takes. You're being ridiculous. I'm their employer, not their arbiter. You're his friend, and you're letting him die. So, this reads like a conversation about a trans person where one party is misgendering them. Someone insisting another person is incorrect to want to be called they over that person's own protestations evokes particular real-world dynamics in a way that I, at least, find impossible to disentangle. In this way, the contemporary singular they has connotations beyond its denotation of a non-gendered referent. We have tied it to queer identity in particular. Victories Greater Than Death by Charlie Jane Anders depicts an intergalactic civilization where everyone introduces themselves with their pronouns. In theory, I love this world-building decision, but I do have to admit, like with singular they, I have a difficult time untangling the practice from its real-world connotations of queer social spaces and attempted inclusivity. There's something comedic about lines like, "My name is Commander Zakog, and my pronoun is she, and you're all my prisoners." This is not a complaint. I love it. Some of the alien characters in the book use neopronouns, such as Wei Wem. As far as I'm aware, Anders invented the pronoun set for this story, and as a result, it reads as far more alien to me than Z ever could. Other non-human characters, though, just use they, them. In particular, the novel draws a distinction between aliens whose genders don't fit the binary because their culture has more than 2 genders, rendered as using neopronouns, and aliens who are non-binary in a way that defies their own culture's gender system, rendered as using they, them. In one scene, a human character, Elsa, is talking to one of these they-them aliens, and we get this piece of world-building about the universal translator. The moment I met you, I just knew that you have a non-binary pronoun, which isn't really a thing in Portuguese. So how did I know that? It's the every speak, Yato says. It lets you know the correct pronoun or assembly code or instigator for everyone. Some people even hear it spoken out loud. But also, different languages have different ways to talk about someone without using their name. Some languages use gender or reproduction, but a lot of others give information about a person's accomplishments, beliefs, or food preferences. And how does it work for your people? Elsa asks. Most Iriaians use either male or female pronouns, Yato says. I started using a gender-neutral pronoun after I went into space, so I had to spend a few cycles concentrating to make sure the Everyspeak accepted it. There are so many implications here, but we're talking about none of them. In The Genesis of Misery by Neon Yang, the Gochi gender-neutral pronoun set is Z here. However, the way Z is used here is different than in many of the books we've discussed. Rather than being a way to refer to specific people whose genders don't fall within the binary, it seems characters only use it when someone's gender is unknown. The modern singular they collapses both of these meanings together, but they are distinct meanings. Actual non-binary people in The Genesis of Misery, or Nixon as they're called in this setting, are referred to with a variety of other pronouns, including they, them, and sie, their. The protagonist Misery, for instance, is a Nixon who uses she, they. You're a Nixon, Ghost says. They speak clear and soft like someone learned and gentle. But it says in your profile that you use they and she pronouns. I don't understand that. What about it don't you understand? They think it over, slow and deliberate. I don't really understand pronouns in general. I use the ones I was given, but you have too. Why is that? How did you decide? She had not expected this. It's almost endearing, the simplicity of their question. Like a benevolent parent, she says, "You'll find it's different for everyone. In my case, I've never cared for gender. Whatever it is, whatever it means." I was raised with she, her pronouns, and it's what I'm used to, but they're just words. So I chose they as my official pronoun. But I was raised with she, and honestly, that's what's in my head. It's not like anything about me changed. And those close to me use she. My family, my comrades. But I insist on they in official terms and in the records because that's important. I'm Nixon, and I want that visibly, tangibly recorded. Does that make sense? I mentioned that Z here was used as a generic gender-neutral pronoun, but the novel has another related usage for it too. That of the inhuman, the divine. When Misery enters her mech, ascends to godhood, neither of those quite capture it. The gestalt of them and their archangel mech are referred to with Z here. Adrenaline blurs the present into a series of snapshots. The archangel, a blaze of white in her vision, nova bright in her consciousness, getting closer. Then she's climbing in, being swallowed, stone moving up her legs. The system's heads-up display goes under, sucked in by the archangel. Misery dissolves into the ecstasy of connection. The delight of once again being one with the universe. The archangel, Misery no Maki, slices through the void, limbs fervid with power and desire to tear into her foes. The mortal human Misery might be subject to doubts and anxiety, but the archangel Misery no Maki perceives the universe with absolute clarity. Z has a single task to complete, and Z will see it done. The book also uses capitalized Z here for the god the characters in this universe worship. There's a sense that divine beings are not just ungendered, but beyond gender. The human characters have digital profiles that other people can see using VR overlays, which include their pronouns. Angels and gods have nothing of the sort. Gender is socially constructed, and they are not a part of the social. The Gender Census is a real-life project that collects data about the language people who identify outside the gender binary use to refer to themselves. It's been running every year for almost a decade now. For the last several years, the most popular neopronouns people report as using are consistently some combination of sie hier, sie them, em, and they, fair. I saw this cited in a linguistics paper about neopronouns and was pretty surprised. Said linguistics paper was a survey asking people to rate how natural the usage of different neopronouns sounded to them. I think it's worth stating that language sounding natural or not in this context is not intended as a value judgment, but a descriptive judgment of how people understand language. For example, the study used control data that had the object and subject form of the pronouns reversed. So you might have a sentence like, him goes to the park, or I talked to they, which do sound pretty strange to my ear. Anyway, they, fair was rated by far the lowest of the neopronouns they tested. Maybe that's why no one's used it in a space opera yet. Part of it may also be that they is an extant word with specific connotations. It doesn't have the same clean, detachable neutrality of a z. It's almost but not quite a noun self pronoun in the style of star, star self, or what have you, which I do think people tend to be more dismissive of. If we're talking real-world connotations, the surface-level associations I think most people have, if any, is that of young queer people with, like, blue hair, which is a pretty far cry from an intimidating spaceship captain. But I mentioned this at length because I think that's an assumption worth pushing back on. More fair representation in sci-fi fantasy. Overall, it seems like when science fiction authors want to convey complex ideas about gender, they reach for neopronouns first and foremost. Not because of their real-world usages, I don't think, but often because of their lack thereof. Part of me feels conflicted here. People who use neopronouns exist in our world now. They are not alien, but speculative fiction writers do this all the time, recontextualizing real words to describe something fantastical. Because it's often easier and clearer than inventing a word whole cloth. Like that excerpt I read from the Genesis of Misery, where Archangel is being used to signify a particular technology, and brings aesthetic and cultural connotations with it that an invented word wouldn't be able to. And if we believe that Z is a real, valuable word, there's no reason we can't use it the same way. What's interesting, though, is that a lot of these sci-fi usages aren't inventing gender identities that don't exist in real life, so much as inventing linguistic distinctions. English's emerging pronoun system is ambiguous. Context is needed to distinguish between singular and plural, generic and definite they. It's unsurprising that not one of these novels solves this problem by inventing a new plural pronoun. Our culture is having active conversation around the gender-neutral singular in a way that we aren't for plural. It makes sense that an author building a pronoun system from scratch would think of this as the place for innovation. Neopronouns occupy a strange position in modern discourse around gender. The mainstream has kind of latched on to singular they as the non-binary pronoun, as if replacing a rigid two-gender system with a rigid three-gender system is somehow a huge improvement. Neopronouns trouble that idea. The difference between someone who uses em and someone who uses faith-air isn't any sort of coherent category, it's just what words they like best. It's vibes-based, and I adore that. In Leckie's most recent book, Gender-Neutral Pronouns Abound. Of the 3 point-of-view characters, one of them uses sie here, another was raised in a genderless alien culture where everyone uses they-them, and the third, named Reet, uses he-him. At one point, the alien protagonist is talking to Reet, and they're speaking in Rajchai, the imperial language from Ancillary justice that doesn't distinguish gender. And, I'm not they, Reet said irritably, and I'm not she either. I'm he. I don't know that word, I said. What does it mean? It means I have a gender. It's they, he, suddenly looked abashed. It's not proper Rajai, but where I come from, people don't like being called the wrong gender, so at some point other pronouns got added into the way we speak Rajai. What? I asked, surprised. Can you do that? Just add words? As it turns out, you can.